is from Ecclesiastes 4, and it's verse 4 through verse 12. Something that Brian mentioned last week that I thought was helpful as I was thinking and reading this through this week is that vanity could be translated or vapor or smoke. And that was just helpful to me. So as I read that, maybe keep that in mind. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from one person's envy of another. This also is vanity and a chasing after wind. Fools fold their hands and consume their own flesh. Better is a handful with quiet than 2 handfuls with toil and a chasing after wind. Again, I saw vanity under the sun. The case of solitary individuals without sons or brothers, yet there is no end to all their toil, and their eyes are never satisfied with riches. For whom am I toiling, they ask, and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up the other. But woe to one who is alone and falls and does not have another to help. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though one might prevail against another, 2 will withstand 1. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. And let's pray. Oh God, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And we ask you this morning to quiet our hearts and prepare our minds now to listen to the words that Brian will bring us in his message this morning. Amen. Ryan, we're interested in hearing about the business of busyness.
All right, well, thank you for that reading and all the worship we've had so far. Before we get into chapters 3 and 4 of Ecclesiastes, though, I'd like to just share a story from the time when I was a youth pastor on the Near East side of Indianapolis, which at least when the time when I was there was kind of one of the more economically depressed regions in town. Well, while I was over there on the Near East side, I was able to start a Bible quizzing program. Bible quizzing was something that I did as a teenager. It was kind of a competitive event to get students to engage with Scripture, so I wanted them to have the same experience. And as a part of this program, there was, at the end of every year, a final competition that was held for the entire country, and it was in different states every year. So this was really exciting for most of these kids. Many of them had never been out of state before, especially during the year that it was in Rochester, New York. That was way outside of their typical experience. So we planned for the trip. We put a lot of energy in it. We did fundraisers and all these types of things, and I remember very vividly when we got there. They were very excited. I sat down and went over a lot of rules with them. Of course, they pushed back on several of the rules, but we made it through. And then I handed out these schedules that they had given us. And these schedules listed the different events. There were some worship services, there were some competition events, there were some social events, lunch and dinner, that kind of thing. And it put a little asterisk by the events that were mandatory. So I passed these out, and the week began, and it was a great time. We had some very meaningful bonding experiences. They did well in the competition. The chapel services were good. It was a great trip. And then on the second to last day, I was starting to think about our return home. And I was looking at the schedule myself for the last day, and I realized that the last day there wasn't really anything substantive. There was just there was a breakfast, an awards ceremony, and then one final chapel service. And as I was talking to the other coaches from the Midwest who had a long way to travel, many of them were planning on skipping out the entire day. Almost all of them were going to skip the last chapel service so they could get a head start on their ride home. So I decided to just ask my teens what they wanted to do. And I said, okay, guys, I just wanted to get your opinion about whether we should stay for this final chapel service or not. And they said, what are you talking about? We have to stay. And I said, well, I mean, we're still going to do breakfast and we're still going to do the awards ceremony. I wasn't suggesting we miss those. It's just the last chapel service, if we wanted to skip it so that we could get a head start going home. And they said, we have to stay. There's an asterisk by it. It's mandatory. And I just remember being so amused by this because I knew for sure that this asterisk was just some planner who was putting together this paperwork and thinking, well, we're going to have this service, so I want people to come. And they mark this little star by it so that people will feel a bit more pressure to come. It didn't have any effect on any of the coaches who knew that there was no weight behind this. It's not like you could say it was mandatory, but it didn't mean anything to us. But to these teens, this was powerful, right? It was mandatory. It was something that you just had to do. I found this so amusing because these were kids who were not afraid to challenge authority. Let's just say that. If you got in their face and you told them, hey, you have to do this, they will stand right back up and say, no, I don't. This was something that we were constantly dealing with. But somehow, when this authority was just subtly written into this piece of paper, they didn't even think to question it. It was mandatory. It was just something that you had to do. Well, as I've gotten older, I think it's become a little bit less funny to me, because I've realized that it's not just teenagers who fall for this trick, but many of us, probably all of us, find ourselves falling for all of these have-tos in society, these things that we feel like we have to do that are required of us, that don't really have any more weight than an asterisk on a piece of paper. And I think that's partially what the teacher is talking about here in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and 4. I gave the NRSV a hard time last week because I didn't appreciate the way that they translated vanity, but I really love the translation from this verse in chapter 3, which says, I have seen the busyness that God has given everyone to be busy with. Besides the fact that this just kind of seems poetic to me, I really find it to be true that everyone seems to be busy. Do you notice this in your life? It seems like everybody is busy all the time. You try to schedule a meeting with 4 people, and it takes half an hour for everybody to look at their schedules and find a little bit of time that works. You want to set up a call with your own family members, and it's a difficult thing to do. We are all just extraordinarily busy all the time. What I find to be mind-boggling is the fact that people have felt this way for thousands of years. This is not just like a modern experience, right? Like the teacher who's writing thousands of years ago is looking around and noticing that everybody feels like they're so busy all the time. Now, I imagine that busyness in the ancient world looked and felt very different from busyness today. In ancient Israel, most people were subsistence farmers, so they probably spent a lot of their time planting and maintaining crops and building their own shelters, and sewing their own clothes and digging wells and making sure they had enough water. Those might not be the same types of things that we are busy with today. And in theory, our lives should be easier, because one of the stories of our linear society, which says that everything is getting better and better, is that this technology keeps coming out, which makes our lives easier and easier, so we don't have to do all of these things. And it's true that, at least speaking for myself, I don't spend hardly any time planting or making shelters or food or anything along those lines. And yet we find ourselves having to work very long hours at jobs in order to make money, perhaps spend time then enhancing our training or education so that we can keep up or have even better opportunities. Then, of course, we have to go shopping. We might have to spend some time in bargain hunting. We have to deal with transportation. We have to deal with all of the different companies that deal with all of the utilities that you have to have in order to live in modern society. And it turns out that we are just as busy, if not busier, than people were thousands of years ago before they had all of these modern conveniences. You can understand why the teacher felt that it was true that there is nothing new under the sun, right? Things seem to change, and yet in some sense, they continue to stay the same. So why is that? Why do we find ourselves kind of stuck in these cycles of busyness? Well, sometimes it is genuinely because of life circumstances. There are times in life when there's a crisis, when we deal with a financial crisis, a health crisis, a family crisis, something that just consumes our time, and there's really nothing that we could do differently. Sometimes life is just intensely busy. But sometimes, even though we might say it's the circumstances, we find ourselves in a state of perpetual busyness. We are always constantly busy. I have been accused of this before, that I say, well, I'm sorry, I'm busy. And my best friend in particular will say, yeah, you always find a way to be so busy, don't you? You know, and so you think, well, what is that then? Why is it, if it's not circumstances, like extraordinary circumstances, it doesn't seem to be technology, like we have the technology to get us through. Well, the teacher makes a very interesting comment about why he thinks we're so busy. At the beginning of our reading today, he says, "Then I saw that all toil and all skill and work come from one person's envy of another." Seems to think that envy is at the core of quite a bit of human busyness. I think to myself, envy, like that just doesn't ring true to me immediately, right? When I think of envy, I typically think of like this kind of inner steaming hatred that you have for somebody who's just so successful or so beautiful or whatever. You kind of want to see them knocked down a peg. But really, that's only one type of envy. Envy is a much broader thing than we typically think. And there are some different languages that actually do a better job of exploring this than English. I'm going to butcher this terribly here. But in the Dutch language, for example, they have two different words that get translated as envy into English. There's afgunst, which sometimes people translate as malicious envy. And then there's benijden, which is sometimes translated as benign envy. I'm not sure that I like the translation of benign envy, but we'll get into that in a minute. Now, afgunst is the one that I was talking about earlier, where you're just so frustrated with somebody that you just kind of want to see them fail. Like they just really bother you. And that's what happens when your envy, the energy of envy is really fixated on another person. But it's also possible that you can kind of be triggered or affected by another person's seeming success, but instead that energy is focused on yourself. Instead of being frustrated that, I wish that they weren't doing so well, it's, man, I really should be doing better. We just internalize it pretty quickly. Now, Afgunst has this kind of destructive energy to it. Oftentimes, if we're going to act on that envy, it's that we kind of want to hurt or do something that would bring down the other person. You can see this sometime in children when when they see one kid who has a toy that they weren't even interested in 2 minutes ago, that all of a sudden now they want to take it away. They don't think anybody should get the toy. That would make them happier than seeing the other kid have a toy that they can't have. And then this Benayadin is, this type of envy is considered to be more productive because it pushes people to stretch themselves in order to keep up. And you might see this in kids too. One kid's just running around doing something ridiculous or crazy, and then the others just go up and join them because, they think it looks fun. They don't want to miss out on whatever it is that the first kid is doing. Now, in society, we tend to praise this second type of envy, or at least we kind of look past it because it does make us work harder. It makes us more focused. It makes us busier. But there's a question about whether it's healthy. And there's also a real sense in which there are institutions in our world that very much want to exploit this tendency. I remember when I had to get a sales job in my first summer after college. The market was not what it is today. It was very tough for an untrained person to get a job. And I found this shady coupon book company that taught us the principles of sales. And one of the principles of sales is essentially something called the Jones effect, according to them. Now, not all sales companies are shady. This was just my experience. But the Jones effect is something where when you are selling coupon books or whatever else it is, they encourage you, if you sell one to one person, then you have to mention that person's name to everybody else that you talk to, because people are more likely to be interested in something if they think their neighbors have it, and they don't want to miss out. Now, I'm not sure how effective that this was at the coupon book selling level, but it's certainly something that works on a bigger scale. It's something that we see social media companies making very effective use of, the sense that other people are having these good experiences and perhaps you're missing out. It's something that's promoted through commercials that are everywhere, billboards and ads and everything you see. It's built into essentially competitions in which we are encouraged to be pit against each other, into grading systems. I mean, I'm saying if Martha, you want to get more people reading their Sunday school books, then grade them when they come in to see how they did. Then all of a sudden, because nobody wants to come into Sunday school and get a C, people, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. I'm not saying that we should do that. Or it doesn't necessarily mean anything, but we are driven by these kind of arbitrary comparisons, right? And in many cases, these things don't actually have any weight to them. It's not like there are any consequences if we just don't do them, but they have such power over our lives. And they're built into our thinking so deeply in the way that we operate. There are things that we do just because we think, well, it's expected of us to do these things. Or I don't know, that's the thing that responsible people are supposed to do. Or everybody else is having this experience, and we don't want to be the only ones to miss out. And so we find ourselves driven by this really subtle power of envy and keeping up. And this is where the teacher's wisdom comes in. Because he is a person who has achieved all the things. Like he was the richest and the wisest and the most successful. He had gotten all of those things. And even then, he still didn't feel satisfied. He said, "Again, I saw vanity under the sun." The case of solitary individuals, let's say maybe workaholics, people who are so focused on getting things done that they're buried in their own world, without sons or brothers, yet there's no end to all their toil, and their eyes are never satisfied with riches. This also is vanity and an unhappy business. Sometimes even after you have achieved the things, you've had the experience, you've made the money, you've accomplished the thing, it still rings hollow. And I think the reason for that is because underneath envy are actually these kind of deep fears that we have as human beings. These fears that maybe we'll never be happy. Maybe we'll never get there. Or maybe we are going to die and be completely forgotten. That our lives will not have mattered at all. Maybe some disaster will come through and we'll be completely unprepared for it and we'll be left helpless. And it's deeply unsettling to kind of think about how powerless we are on the face of these things. And so we take some comfort in at least feeling, well, as long as I'm doing better than at most other people, as long as I'm ahead of the curve, then maybe I'm okay. But that's not how it works. The teacher has an answer to those who hope that, who have these deep fears, right? That maybe, what if something bad happens to me? What if I'm forgotten? It's not particularly comforting, though. You sure you want to hear it? Yeah, you're probably right. There's a good chance that you never will land on that perfect contentment and happiness. There's a good chance that you probably won't be remembered by anybody in time. There's a good chance that something could happen to you that will incapacitate you and make it impossible for you to pursue all of your dreams. He says this from the perspective not of some pessimist who's never had enough good opportunities, but as somebody who's had the best of opportunities and still doesn't feel like there's much hope. So what are we supposed to do with all of this? Well, from the teacher's perspective, he says, look, you might not be able to secure these big abstract reassurances, but most of us have at least something in our life that can be incredibly meaningful, and that is other people. The people in our lives who love us, who care about us. I mean, think about it. There are, in our world today, 8 billion people, more or less. I mean, tons of people. There's so much that there is out there to watch, to do, to follow. There are many people who are smarter and more interesting and happier than any one of us in this room is. And yet, despite that, there are people in our world who want to know about us, who are interested in how we are doing and what we are thinking and how we feel. And that is something that is incredibly precious. The value of a relationship with another person who sees us and whom we see. This is why Ecclesiastes says 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift the other, but woe to the one who is alone and falls and does not have another to help. Now, I want to be clear here that the kind of aloneness he's talking about is not being unmarried. This passage is sometimes read at weddings, and that's fine. But this isn't a romantic type of relationship. This is about having friendships. It's about having meaningful connections. It can be with siblings. It can be with spouses. It can be with neighbors, people who have no immediate immediate relation to us. And yet, if the relationship is strong enough that other people care enough about us, then there is some support in that. We can't guarantee that there's not going to be some crazy economic crisis that will make all of the money we've been saving turn into dust. But even if that happens, the people in our lives who care about us aren't going to just let us wither away. We matter. That's our real resource. Any one of us could find ourselves in a situation where we're falsely accused of something, and then our reputation is in ruins, and nobody wants to be associated with us, and no one wants to be around us. But the people who know us and the people who love us will stand by us, and we'll find how meaningful those relationships are. But what if we don't have any relationships like that? Or what if there's something about us that is just so unseemly that nobody would want to stick it out through all of the highs and lows? Well, I don't think that the teacher has a very good answer to this, frankly, from his limited perspective. But we do know from the revelation in Jesus that even if we feel ignored by everybody else, there is a God who loves us, who cares for us, and who wants to relate to us even if the world around us crumbles. Jesus says, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten in God's sight. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. And do not be afraid, you are of more value than many sparrows." We may not be able to earn our way or fight our way into any kind of grand significance. Even if we are able to do this, it's not likely that that is going to satisfy or address all of our problems. But there is a God who loves us. And this God invites us to be in a community of people who love us and want to see us and value us. And that doesn't mean that we can avoid participating in all of the systems that try to push us to be busy and run around everywhere. I mean, that's a part of life. But if we are centered in that, then it might give us the ability to sometimes push back, to say, no, this doesn't really matter. I don't have to follow this asterisk, We don't have to try to keep up with everybody else. We don't have to pursue all of these things in order to try to be happy. We don't have to run ourselves ragged in order to gain just an ounce more of security because we think that relief is around the corner. Instead, following the advice of Ecclesiastes, we should appreciate the friendships in our life. And most of all, the friendship that can hold us through the sands of time, that with the God who loves us and offers us redemption and healing.